Anna Rosling Ronland, it is an honor speaking with you today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, you're one of the authors of the book Factfulness with your husband and late father in law. And it's one of the best books I've read in the last 10 years. It was refreshingly truthful and positive about the world, which I think is just like cuts through so much of the noise with so much signal. And I really appreciate that about it. I've recommended it to a lot of people and gifted it to people. And so I'm honored to be speaking with you today. I know the work the three of you have done together goes back long before Factfulness. So I wanted to ask you what spurred the idea for Gapminder and then the subsequent book, Factfulness.
Well, I mean, we started more than 20 years ago, and in the beginning, it was not really meant. There was no real plan that was long-term strategic. It was more that I met with Ola when I was 16, and he was also 16. We were actually going to the same school, and both of us had the intentions to work within arts, and we had no idea of doing smart career choices whatsoever. So we pretty much wanted to do whatever. And then gradually over the years, Ola's father was very inspirational and very frustrated about things that he ran into when he was trying to lecture to his students at the medical school about sort of the state of the world. And he was very frustrated. And since both me and Ola was studying social sciences and arts, basically the frustrations he had sort of combined arts and social sciences in a way. How can you simplify the big picture of the world and the trends so that people grasp it, even though they are not very interested to start with and don't spend much time. So we started little by little doing things for him, together with him, and on our own, showing him ideas how it could be simplified, and that was sort of the starting point. And then Ola was about to write a thesis in economic history, and we had already a bubble chart with static bubbles. But then, as he didn't like to write theses at all, he tried to figure out how he could get his credits without actually writing the thesis. So he realized, if I take the static chart with the bubbles and I sort of play it backwards and then play it forward in like a demo, or more like a movie, or where you can interact just a tiny bit, then that would, I mean, obviously that would be economic history, and he would maybe get the credit points without writing. So it started as sort of a lazy workaround to get away from what was expected from him. And he had a professor at the university who, when he asked, "Can I do this?" and the professor said, "Well, nobody reads these theses anyways, so sure, go ahead," which is very unusual for the Swedish system, that someone was sort of open-minded enough, because it's usually quite strict. So I would say that was the starting point. And then Hans brought the first drafts of that we were developing during nighttime, actually, in a magazine producing uh, computer hall, where we were not allowed. I was not allowed at all, and Ola was only allowed to write on. He was co-editing a small magazine, cultural magazine. So because of that, he had access to this computer room, and we had no computers at home. And I snuck in when it was nighttime and everyone else had left. So we were sitting there working during like a secret night shift, you could say. And then gradually, Paul started to show the drafts we had been doing to different professors and WHO and so on, and they were pretty obsessed, because for the first time ever they could see how the world was animating and changing. So I would say that was the starting point. And then gradually we refined, and we started doing other visualizations ideas. So in the beginning it was mostly around visualizing data, make it interactive and understandable. And it was also around getting the data from the big data producers, the global public data, getting that data freely available to the end users, because at that point most data was behind paywalls, and we were extremely frustrated and said we have to do something about it. So we were sort of an activist approach of releasing the data from the UN and the World Bank. So early on, we actually took one of the World Bank indicators, World Development indicators that you had to purchase very cumbersome through faxing different checks and stuff to get a single user license on a CD-ROM. And we actually downloaded all the data and put it behind our tools. And then we uploaded it on the internet for free for anyone to use. And we told them at the World Bank that we were doing that. We said this data should be free, right? So then they said, we might need to sue you because you're not allowed to do this. And then we said, go ahead. Because at that point in time, they had a very bad reputation and it was a lot of demonstrations against them. So we thought it would be interesting to see where that would end, because we were just a tiny nonprofit and they was the huge bank. And then actually during the whole process, we were also collaborating with them actually at the statistical division. So we were open with what we were doing, and we were continuing to collaborate all the time actually, because it was really good professionals. They were just stuck in an old-fashioned pay system. So
Wow.
so no hard feelings, I would say, at the end, but it was a little bit tense now and then.
Wow, that's
So that was
fascinating.
yeah, so that was sort of the starting point, that we were, but still, as you can hear, it might not be the smartest career choices we made. We were basically trying things out, following our hearts, and then gradually realizing that we were sort of inventing things as we went. And then we were a portion at Google because they acquired the bubble charting things. We were there trying to implement it and improve the search quality for public statistics. And then we came back to Sweden again and wanted to develop more free teaching materials, because we realized that it's not enough to have free access to the data. It's not enough to browse data. It's not enough to be able to search data, because still, if you don't ask the right questions, you will still get bad results back, right? So we started realizing we should develop more of a teaching materials, giving people more like frameworks and explanations and those kinds of things. And then we started testing in small scales what people thought about the world, what they knew. So we asked fact questions to just get an idea what we were going to focus on, because we didn't want to make the same educational materials like everyone else. We wanted to know that we were focusing on things people were wrong about. What happened then, which was it was actually a bit discouraging, because what we found was that people were wrong about most things we tested.
Mhm.
So that didn't really help prioritizing. And somewhere there we realized maybe it's not enough. Maybe we should try to write a book. People had been asking us to do that, and we had always been pretty harsh and said that is the old format. People don't read books. They shouldn't. They should browse data. They should interact, for free online and stuff. But we were frustrated, and we thought maybe we give it a try. And then we started writing the book. And halfway through, Hans passed away, and we continued writing it. And then and the book came out, and it has been read by quite many people so far. So I think that was probably a good idea to add that to what we had been doing previously.
Well,
And
that gives
since
a
the
lot
book,
of.
yeah, sorry,
Go ahead, sorry.
go ahead.
Well, that gives a lot of context to and background to the fact that you're like 2 pages that say 16 bad things going down, I think, and 16 good things going up, which is like some of my favorite 2 pages in any book. And there's basically not any words. And so it's like perfectly summarizes um, the the thesis project your husband was working on through to everything that you guys came up with in the book. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, so writing the book was sort of the last resort. That was never the plan. It was written out of frustration because we thought the other plans didn't work as well as we were hoping.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So, I mean, so that takes us to like a core premise of the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, being that the media skews negative for eyeballs, most likely. which is basically teaching people to think the world is worse off than it is. Um, and I would define the media, or we could say traditional media, like news channels, newspapers, and large media outlets digitally now. But I'm curious to think, do you think social media and the internet is better or worse than traditional media at getting the correct information to people?
I would. I think that that is a hard one. I think you
Yeah.
have pros and cons, and I think we will.
Hmm.
We will. We're too early on in the social media phase to really know how it's going to be used. I think we're just trying it out at the moment, and I think it can
Yeah.
go either way. But I would say on the good end, we have a democratization of information that we have never had, right? Because
Hmm.
people can report from whatever is going on real time and share it with everyone. So on one hand, you can say we have a much better access to information, first-hand information. It's rapid. Everyone can be part of a bigger story. So I think in that sense, it's amazing, and it doesn't have to go through these paywalls where you have the traditional media that actually always have locked out a lot of people from consuming it. So that
Hmm.
I think is a very good thing. Uh,
Yep.
Even amazing. And if we manage to use it smartly, I think it can really make a big difference, and people can find information at the much higher speed, much more relevant, and so on. But on the other end, we have the people who were already before in their own bubbles, and as people start to consume like what is labeled as like media, I would say news, less
Right.
and less. You're only consuming what you have within your community. It might, on the other hand, quite easily tip over and become the people that are have very clear and strong opinions about something might be even more like even harder to convince about something else because they will not leave their bubble in a way. But I
Hmm.
but I but I would say that I'm in many ways I think maybe a little bit naively optimistic anyways because I when we compare, very often we compare like the high quality written, like um, the newspaper kind of idea, or you have the analysis and very highly professional writers in the like most noble papers. But
Hmm.
very few people consume them, and very few people have consumed them, even historically. Most people never consume that. So even though that might be the sort of the best possible solution, if if almost no one consumes it, then it might not be. Then it
Yep.
might be better to have something that is less fantastic, but at least it's not totally wrong, and that can reach a lot of people. So I think it's a pretty hard balance, and I think I
Hmm.
can really see pros and cons on both. But I do not like the as a general approach to life and what's happening. I prefer to be on the naively optimistic side, embracing that the new technology we have actually opens up for amazing possibilities. It, I do think maybe we need to have a higher. It puts, I don't find the word in English, but it makes it more important for all of us to be active and participate and be serious in what we produce and consume. So it puts a bigger pressure, I would say, on all of us being sort of part
Hmm.
of the society and what is happening, when we could rely on a few experts writing the proper the proper articles. We could be passive and not even look at them.
Right.
So I'm not sure that it's better either. So it's a hard balance, I
Mhm.
think.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about some of the data and statistics that are improving across the world. So, I mean, one being that extreme poverty has been dropping for decades, um, which is unequivocally a good thing. I'm wondering what are the main factors that you think drive that trend, that positive trend?
I would say that I mean, I think it's a combination of several different things. Of course, one
Mm-hmm.
is that we know it's pretty easy to know what you're supposed to do to help people out of extreme poverty. You do infrastructure things like you build roads, you build sanitation, you build schools, you have people learning to read and write. You know, all these basics, get them clean
Mm-hmm.
water. You know, very very basic things that actually makes it possible for people to sort of leave the extreme poverty they are in. So, on one hand, you need to give the poorest communities the possibilities to leave it. And that is more like an aid driven kind of approach because they don't have the money to invest to do that for themselves. As soon as they get
Mm-hmm.
out of the extreme poverty, it starts to be different because then they can access things and they might be healthy enough. They can read the labels on the medical box at least a
Right.
little, you know, so you will not be fooled by others and so on. So that is one thing. But then we have maybe the biggest that the economic growth that has happened in so many countries. It itself have made it possible to sort of do those investments, which makes it possible for people to live. And a big portion of it has been in China, right, where
Mm-hmm.
people have left the rural countryside kind of China and been improving. And quite often, I think quite often when you read in the data itself that is produced by the World Bank and the UN and so on, it looks a little bit like they are the ones who have made this big change. But I think a lot
Mm-hmm.
of it has been an economic growth that has happened, especially in Asia, which have made a lot of people move. And then the trend has been very, very positive, right? When you see the extreme poverty, that doesn't mean that when you leave extreme poverty, that life is good or safe, because most
Mm-hmm.
people who leave the extreme poverty will fall back because you're not
Mm-hmm.
safe, even though you have left. It's enough that a family member gets a disease, and then you might fall back again, or a bad year, or whatever. So, but at least you see that trend. But I would say for the remaining, you know, 10% ish, you know, a little bit depending on exact numbers, but somewhere around there, nine maybe. Uh, the last ones will most likely be harder to get out of extreme poverty because the ones you have left are locked into like pretty hard to reach areas. It might be conflicts. It might be very, very hard
Yeah.
to reach them because of infrastructure issues and so on. So I think even though I think we should strive to get to eradicate extreme poverty, that is not some it's not a decent way of living, and we should make sure that we help people out of extreme poverty. But I do think that getting the last people out will be more tricky than what we have seen
Mm-hmm.
so far.
Gotcha. You
But if we
mentioned,
don't, yeah,
Mhm.
it's worth to say though. But if we don't get them out, as people in extreme poverty are getting many more children per
Yep.
person than they do up here, that means
Right.
as long as we have a lot of people left there, we will have a hard time to actually decrease it because it will continue to grow by itself in a way. So by helping them out of that, what we see is that people tend to get fewer kids as they get more stable lives. So that would be also a way of ensuring that we get rid of it and give people a decent life at the same time.
Well, so now I'm just jumping around, but I am curious to ask you about that one. How the amount of children each woman has, let's say, as a measure, goes down as the country gets richer, as you just said. Now, I could see two sides to that. One is the poorer countries have more kids because more of them die, and maybe also they need more of them to help work and earn. And so, if you're having fewer kids, it's a luxury, and you have the same amount of kids that you raise and fewer die. That's a good thing. The other, on the flip side, like having fewer kids, and if like more and more women have no kids, that's potentially a negative. I mean, having children, raising children's such a great important part of life. So I mean, there's nuance in all of them, but how would you view that statistic, as a good thing or a bad thing or both? Or what are your
I
thoughts
would
on it?
say, I, I mean, the like if you take the world average is somewhere
Hmm.
around, it's pretty reasonable, somewhere around two-ish, up to two to three somewhere.
Hmm.
And I mean, if we look at the people in extreme poverty, I mean, historically, most of us populate, humanity used to live in extreme poverty. That is what we come from.
Yeah.
And there was a few
Right.
people who were better off. And
Hmm.
back in the history, when we got six kids, four of them died for different reasons. So basically, we were
Right.
just reproducing. That's why we can see that the population did not grow much historically. Then we started to be able to improve life quality and cure some of the worst things, and the kids started to survive.
Yeah.
So what we have now is that we can actually cure quite a lot of things kids used to die from, but
Hmm.
people are still in extreme poverty, continuing to get all these kids as a like, some extra measure and extra labor and so on. So it's all about on that end. It's all about improving life quality and getting people out of extreme poverty. I think that is the only thing we should do that is really effective. As we can
Hmm.
see that in all countries where people have gotten out of extreme poverty, or not countries, but people who get out of extreme poverty, it might take a generation, but you will see how the number of kids is decreasing without
Hmm.
force, right? So people are
Yeah. Yeah.
solving
Right.
that over generations pretty quickly. On our
Hmm.
end, among the richest, then I think we have the complete opposite. We have the luxury problem in a sense, right? That we can much more decide how many kids we want to have, and there we have the opposite, where you could see, especially in some Asian countries, where the getting kids, if you are becoming a mom, sort of ruins your work life in many ways, right?
Hmm.
And as long as we have those tendencies where it's hard to be a mom and have kids at the same time, and working, keeping the
Hmm.
job, then I think a lot of women are actually choosing to keep working in a way, because otherwise they are stuck in a lot of like I don't know, they lose a lot of opportunities when they get kids in a way, right? And they
Hmm.
become, I wouldn't say downgraded to being only moms, but in a way, right? And it's so fun to work. So I can truly understand that. In Sweden, where
Hmm.
I live, I mean, just on the radio news a few days ago, it was a discussion that the statistical bureau of Sweden had totally miscalculated the amount of kids per family. So we have had a much more positive trend than all other European countries, more or less. And now
Oh,
they
really?
are realizing that that doesn't really, it's not true anymore. So now Sweden behaves much more like all the other European countries. And that confuses quite a lot, because usually, if you would have asked me this question half a year ago, I would have
Hmm.
said that with the Swedish system for actually combining work life and being a mom, where you can get different kinds of compensations and you can stay at home on like maternal leave and so on, and even paternal leaves that are
Yep.
pretty generous. Then we have had another outcome with more kids than the other European countries, especially Southern European countries. But now, when the Swedish numbers are changing, and they were discussing with some researchers around that, and they couldn't really explain. For some reason, even though we have basically one of the best, or maybe even the best system for combining work life and having kids, we are doing more or less what the others are doing. So I'm not sure. Therefore, I'm not sure if I can use my usual explaining model here, because it's just shaking a little bit.
Mm.
But I mean, overall, I would say that is a very important thing to make sure that especially women gets a decent possibility of combining work life and kids. And then I think maybe bad times, as we consider it now, when when it feels like it's a bit shaky and unstable. Maybe people are waiting a little bit to see what happens with the war in Ukraine, maybe, and the climate discussions and so on. So it's yeah. So maybe that is also influencing. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I didn't even answer your question. I'm not sure.
No, it was good. There's just context to it on both sides. I'm sure, like every statistic, right? There's good and bad, and in all of it. So I think the book came out in 2018. Is that right? And since then, we had COVID, of course, 2020 to recently, or still feeling the effects for a long time, I'm sure. And part of that being that we unplugged the global economy, which I didn't know there was even a switch for. So, how do you think the facts and figures look post COVID, and post writing the book?
So, I mean, I would say, as we are usually mainly focusing on the longer trends and bigger
Right.
proportions globally, I would say
Mm-hmm.
it has surprisingly little effect. If you do the big global comparison, it was not like the Spanish flu, for instance, where you had a lot of people dying. It was compared to what we can see, those absolute biggest killers we have had. It wasn't one of those. And even the economic backlash, it wasn't, even if all of us felt it, I mean, it didn't collapse totally, even though we could all sense the risk. We were close in a way, right?
Yep.
So I would say, of course, we were affected. Maybe especially like we felt that we were not immortal, which I think all of us sort of felt before in a way.
Mm-hmm.
We were like, we didn't really pay attention to, yeah, I don't know, production chains or that we had the
Yeah.
health, right? We were just assuming that that was something stable that we could rely on. So I do think in many ways it was important for us to realize how sensitive it is and how fragile we are, and that when big risks are happening, we mentioned that in the book, like the big risks for the future, like pandemic was the
Mm-hmm.
first one we were mentioning. And when we wrote the book, that was before the pandemic, it looked
Yep.
almost ridiculous that we were writing about like a flu, you know,
Yeah.
stupid. But it can actually cause quite a lot. So I do think, I hope at least, that what that did was that it increased our humility, realizing that we need to actually be careful about the systems we have, and we need to be able to continue world peace so we can collaborate, because the biggest threats we have are mainly global. They are not
Mm-hmm.
local. Before, things were local. Now it starts to become more global. We depend on each other and collaborations. So it's pretty wise to uh, be staying friends, across borders, and
Mm-hmm.
realizing that we might need to collaborate pretty fast. And that was very amazing, I think, with the when the pandemic hit, that we as a species managed to collaborate with the research and creating the vaccines in much shorter time than ever. I think any vaccine at any point in time before. um, and we collaborated across borders, which was, even though, I mean, there are some complaints here and there of people
Mm-hmm.
holding on to their own data, but as a whole, it's pretty amazing. And that those vaccines managed to reach people pretty fast in so many different places. So I think that. I think, I mean, one of the reasons we wrote the book was because at that time, a lot of things were actually looking pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
uh, and people were still overly pessimistic, and you could
Right.
have the sense that everything is getting worse. So it was written out of that frustration, trying to say there are huge global risks that we shouldn't forget about, because they are
Mm-hmm.
huge. If it will come a pandemic, if it will be a world war, if it will be an economic collapse, then
Mm-hmm.
we're screwed, right? In many ways. So we need to
Yeah.
make sure that we stay on track. So the book was written in that frustration. Then when things started shaking, I would say some of the premises for some of the motivation to why we wrote it might at that point in time was maybe not, maybe the world was more like what we were talking about we should pay attention to than it could be in a way, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
so I think the book was written in I would say we wrote it because we think the biggest problem for humans, I would say, when we have huge problems we need to solve, the biggest risk is that we lose hope. Because I think if we don't feel hope, why would we care, right? If it is the doomsday and if everything is going bad, if the climate is collapsing and it's no use to get kids to the world, then we could as well stay, binge watching Netflix while the world collapses. But if we want to keep improving the world, which I think is a smarter choice, as I mean, humans, we have never been so educated as we are
Yeah.
today. We've never had as good communication system as we have today. But we need to collaborate and we need to solve some of the huge problems we still have ahead of us or is going on right now. Like solving the whole climate issue, which is a global thing we need to work on, then we need to keep hope so that we have the energy to keep working on trying to solve the problem. So I think that it might be the underlying key why we talk about the positive trends, because to remind people that we have historically we have actually moved humanity from being uh, from living in extreme poverty to actually living in this quite amazing times that we are in. And now we should make sure that the poorer ones actually get a chance to join us in more decent living conditions, and that we figure out how to try to prevent the worst climate risks, for instance, and all the other risks. But I think we need to stay positive in a way, and we need to keep hope.
So yeah, I wanted to ask you about the global warming, climate change sort of topic because I mean, I think I read, I don't know if it was you guys felt it or not, but you guys got some pushback, as I interpret it, as not being negative enough about
Yeah,
climate. Again, not
uh,
playing into like you should be kind
yeah,
of saying what the media is saying is what people wanted you. I interpret it that way, but you also present the data, right? And this is how I'm looking at it. Please correct me if you think I'm wrong in any way, but I mean, carbon emissions have increased like this and probably exponentially, right? And but that has coincided with improvements in humans' lives. I mean, the more we emit carbon, the better people's lives get is one way to look at it. And then, over the last century or so, climate related deaths are down 98, 99%, something like that. So, I mean, so then I want to ask the question with that data, if that's truthful and I'm analyzing that correctly, in what way would decreasing carbon emissions be good for humans?
um, I mean, obviously, if we continue to emit quite a lot, that will continue to cause problems on the environment. We shouldn't do that, and on the climate will continue to get worse. And I think the main thing is when we continue to emit in that way, um, it will be so long time before it basically getting it out of out of the air is quite
Mm-hmm.
tricky, and it takes quite a long time. So as long as we continue to fill, it will be like years and years and years when we have to reduce it. So basically, for by continuing as we do now, we just keeps increasing the problem. So we put it
Mm-hmm.
we're already feeling some sense of it, and we're putting a bigger and bigger problem ahead of us. So in that sense, I think definitely it's very important that we make sure that we uh, have a lot of research and implement more environmentally friendly solutions. I do think what is important is if we look at the emissions, if we divide the world population into groups on 10% of the population in each group, from the poorest to the richest, you can see that almost everything that is emitted by the richest 10%. So I do
Yep.
think it's important to remember that helping people out of extreme poverty and getting like richer and better life quality doesn't do much on the environment as a whole. What we should focus on if we want to have a big impact fast, we need to focus on how we are consuming and producing in the richest countries and among the richest 10%, because it's even though we manage to reduce how much CO2 emissions, for instance, we emit per person, the problem is the world population is getting richer slowly and the population is increasing. So even if we reduce the emission per person, more people will most likely end up in the richer end, which makes
Hmm.
they might take out each other, right? So we need to probably diminish what we emit much more to be ready to sort of meet the new people who come there. But I do think it's an important challenge. We need to show the way because we do have the research funding up here among the richest 10%, and we need to get ways of consuming in place and producing so that when the big hump of the world population, who is now much poorer, but when that comes, if the trends continues, there will be more, like millions more, billions more coming to consume the way we are. Then,
Hmm.
if we had managed to research so that we can have the same life quality but a smarter way of doing it, I think that would be excellent. That we take the cost for doing that so they can come and sort of enjoy whatever we have invented, which I'm hoping will happen. But I mean, of course, I know it's not always people collaborate the way you want them to, and finding the solutions we need as fast as we want to. But I still think that that is the challenge. So I think understanding the world today, the global picture is basically getting the poorest 10% out of extreme poverty is absolutely necessary, and getting the consumption among the 10% richest to be better for the climate is also essential. But those two, I think, are extremely different kinds of problems. And very often when we talk about, for instance, sustainable development, which is the term we hear every time, it sounds like we, in every single project, should combine both. And very often then we see projects that end up in like middle income settings trying to solve both environment and sort of health related issues, which is sort of missing both of the ends where the problems are the biggest. So,
Yeah, I
yeah.
see. Yeah.
So basically separating them and realizing where which problem is most pressing.
So I know we've got to go soon. So I wanted to ask you one more bigger question, I guess. And you had said basically, in a lot of ways, the world improves by economically pulling these people's populations, countries out of poverty and giving opportunity and access to the global economy. And that so I'm curious about the structure of the global economy. So in my mind, it's the dollar became the world reserve currency after World War II, the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944, 1945, and essentially the U.S. became the currency that everyone transacted in globally, and then secondly, we sort of policed the world's waterways so that you could participate in the global economy without with protection of the U.S. Navy. And so I'm curious to know, like, what role has that played, the dollar as the world's reserve currency, positively or negatively in uplifting lives around the world? And then do you think it will be positive or negative from here forward?
From for what? I didn't hear the last part. For
Oh, the second
positive or
part is, and then
negative?
um, from here forward, do you think the dollar's continuing to be a positive or a negative thing in the next 20 years as it's been the last 60 or something?
Yeah. So to start with, I would say I'm too little of an economist to say whether the dollar itself is important. But having
Hmm.
a shared global economy with where it's easy to actually do
Hmm.
trade over the borders, I think is very crucial. If that should be moving forward, if that should be the dollar, or if there would be another system, I think
Hmm.
I have no. I wouldn't dare to say anything about that, but I do think it's very important that we have an effective way of collaborating, and that of course
Hmm.
includes that we need to have the flow of money and resources actually highly functioning. The first part of the question I forgot. Sorry.
I was wondering what role you think that structure played in the positive trends of the world from 1944 until today.
I do think it has had a pretty important role that we managed to actually make all these. When I mean, basically, what today makes it both amazing that we can produce products that have small, tiny bits from all over the world within them.
Hmm.
If you look in a computer, and you will have parts from all over, for instance, or a car or so, which is pretty amazing that humans managed to make that collaboration, and that could have a lot of economies to grow. I mean, pretty cool. On the other hand, when the pandemic hit, it was pretty obvious that it was pretty. It's a bit tricky to maintain
Hmm.
when suddenly countries are closing, and then suddenly the
Yeah.
flow of goods doesn't really work. And when you have also, when we talk about the cargo ships, when they are being attacked in different ways, or the U.S. Navy, like the insurance companies don't want to. I don't know what you call it. Insure them is not the word,
Hmm.
but you know what I mean. When the insurance
Yep.
companies back out because they
Yeah.
see too much risk, then suddenly we have a very fragile system. So I
Yeah.
do think it's. I think it's a bit.
Yep.
I really don't dare to say where it's going. You could see tendencies in countries trying to make their markets more self-sustaining, and I think in one way it's probably sound to have to sort of check what would happen in different kinds of crises. What can we produce? What can we not? What will we lack? How will we solve that? I think that might be it's a good thought process to maybe figure out some of the obstacles that you could solve when we are in better times, so we are more ready if bad times come. But on the other hand, I'm a bit afraid of the no, of the very the sort of closing of borders and thinking about each region as a
Hmm.
having to be living in its own bubble. I think that might be a danger for the global peace, basically, because I do think
Yeah.
one of the reasons we're not fighting so much, where we're not fighting quite often, we are actually exchanging things or collaborating. So
Yeah.
I'm a little bit afraid of the idea of sort of closing down and thinking more about us here in this country, how we would survive, and less about how we as a species will
Hmm.
organize the flows together. So I hear it might sound a little bit like naively optimistic, but I do think it's important to keep collaborations and
Yeah.
communications, because if we get a world war, then nothing will work. I'm
Right.
basically then we're screwed in many ways. So
Yeah.
keeping that, I think, yeah.
Well, you say you're not much of an economist, but I think you just hit on like the 3 to 5 biggest questions for the global economy in the next few decades. So you did well enough in my mind. um, so, Anna, thank you very much for taking the time. Anna's recording this from the airport. It was nice enough to share her little window of time here before a flight. So I'd encourage everybody to buy the book Factfulness. It is one of the best books I've read. You also have gapminder.org. You have Dollar Street. I will link to all those places for people that are listening. Is there anyone else or anywhere else you'd like to send people so they can
You
connect with
could
you?
also, yeah, on our website, we do have also the Upgrader project, where we're posting. We have tested about 10,000 fact questions around all the UN goals, the SDGs, every single indicator, trying to figure out, getting a bigger picture of what people are wrong about. And we're constantly posting questions on that website, the Worldview Upgrader. You will find it at thegapminder.org. And that's a place where you can test your factual knowledge about the world, and most likely you will be surprised how wrong you most likely are. So it's like very simple ABC questions and small
Yeah.
tests. So I would encourage you to do that, to sort of become a little bit more, getting the humility and the curiosity, trying to figure out if we're going to make the world better together in many ways, then maybe it's important that we have an idea about what's going on using the biggest, public data sources for global trends and proportions. So I think that might be a thing you can do as well.
I went 10 for 15 on one of the tests last night, so I'm like sort of an idiot. So I'm
Oh,
proud of that.
no, 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 no. That's amazingly good, I can tell you. Yeah.
Well, Anna, thank you very much for taking the time today.
Thank you so much.